of Council, I recognise the traditional custodians of the land and pay tribute to elders past and present. My name is Virginia Leaf. I'm the Manager of Corporate Communications. Thank you for all attending tonight. This is a forum to explain the New South Wales Government's proposed low to mid-rise housing planning policy with a particular regard to Gordon Ward. I would like to introduce councillors here tonight. The Mayor, Councillor Sam Nye, the Deputy Mayor, Christine Kay, Gordon Ward councillors Barbara Ward and Simon Lennon, and Roseville Ward councillor, Councillor Alec Taylor. They're at the front. Hiding in plain sight. Unfortunately, this room has a restriction for capacity for legislative obligations for fire safety evacuation purposes, and that's why we have to cap it. So it was capped at it's capped at around 140, and we had 138 people on Friday, so we had to close it. But we are recording it tonight, so it will be online. So if any people you know are disappointed they couldn't get in, it will be available online. Okay, so tonight's structure is that we will do a presentation and then have questions and answers afterwards. There'll be plenty of time to ask your questions and answers. If you submitted a question when you registered, we answered it in the presentation, but if we didn't, please feel free to answer it again. Yes, please. No one take pictures if that's okay, because you have to get people's consent. So thank you. And also with recording, it's the same thing. We're recording it, so you'll be able to see it again. And if you do want to take photos, please ask the person who you want to take a photo of. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce David Marshall, Council's General Manager. David Marshall.
Thank you, Virginia. And hello everybody, and thank you for coming tonight. The New South Wales Government's housing policies would result in extensive changes for Ku-ring-gai, and we understand there's a lot of uncertainty in the community, and we hope that our session tonight will help you to understand more about what is proposed. As mentioned, we're here primarily to talk about the low and mid-rise housing policy, and Council specifically resolved to conduct community forums for each ward about these policies. However, we do recognise that there is a lot of interest in the transit-oriented development policies as well, and we understand that you may have questions about that at the end. So to recap, the TOD, as the transit-oriented development is referred, affects properties within 400 metres of the train stations of Gordon, Killara, Linfield and Roseville. It took effect on the 13th of May 2024 and has received most of the public interest to date. The low and mid-rise housing policy is not yet in place, but if enacted, it will impact on a very large proportion of the LGA as well. In terms of Council's position on these matters, Council has made a number of recent resolutions in support of more housing, but has expressed concern about the approach taken by the state government and has resolved that it does not believe the plans will create the best outcome for the future residents and the environment. With regard to the TODCEP, following a resolution, Council has commenced legal action seeking to declare the CEP invalid. Council also resolved to commence studies around the 4 TOD precincts of Gordon, Killara, Linfield and Roseville to explore better resident outcomes than what is currently proposed. The study, scenario analysis and community engagement are to be presented before councillors within 9 months for a decision. With regard to the low and mid-rise CEP, Council by resolution has requested a 12-month deferral from the New South Wales Government upon agreeing reasonable 5 and 20-year dwelling targets. The targets would form a basis of an update to Council's LEP over 12 months with the intent to provide a superior outcome for future residents. At this point in time, the New South Wales Government has not responded to Council's request for a deferral. Thank you again for coming tonight, and we'll now move into the detailed presentation, and I'll hand you over to the Director, Strategy and Environment, Mr. Andrew Watson.
Good evening, everybody. In terms of the starting point for this exercise, when the federal Labor government came into power a couple of years ago, they signed off with state and local government bodies what is referred to as the National Housing Accord. So the state-oriented development, or the TOD program, and the explanation of intended effects, which is, or the EIE, which I'll refer to tonight, which relates to the low and mid-rise housing SEP, are the New South Wales response to that National Housing Accord. So in terms of what's broadly proposed, as the General Manager alluded to, you've got the 4 TOD sites around the 4 southernmost train stations, Roseville, Linfield, Killara and Gordon. So what that allows is development in the order of 6 to 7 stories within 400 metres of the 4 train stations, measured from a point in the centre of the train stations themselves. Now, in terms of the low-rise element of the low and mid-rise housing SEP, what that allows is terraces, townhouses and manor houses within 800 metres of all of the train stations and the St Ives shopping centre. And the mid-rise part of the low and mid-rise housing SEP allows residential flat buildings in R2, R3 and R4 zones. And when it was exhibited, first as the explanation of intended effects, it allowed shop top housing within the local centre zones, which generally in the case of Ku-ring-gai is E1, but it can also be MU1, which is mixed use. So when I refer to local centre zones, E1 zones or MU zones, what that generally is going to be is the commercial areas largely up and down the highway corridor and the St Ives area. And I'll use those words interchangeably just to confuse everybody and probably myself as well. Now, in terms of why we're here, 31st of January, Council did a combined session on both state policies as we knew them at the time. One of them had been on exhibition since, the TOD had been on exhibition since mid-December, but that was a limited form of exhibition where the general public wasn't open to it. And the low and mid-rise housing SEP also went on exhibition mid-December through to late February. So what Council resolved in early April 2016, or 2024-16, was that after we got more information back from the state government on the low and mid-rise housing SEP, that we would run a number of forums largely targeted at the low and mid-rise housing SEP. Because of time constraints and community interest at the time, the focus of the January session was really on the TOD program, and we now know a little bit more about the low and mid-rise housing SEP, which is why we are here today. So, like I said, low and mid-rise housing SEP from the 15th of December through to the 23rd. Council has made a submission on that low and mid-rise housing SEP on the 21st of the 2nd, and the policy refinement paper that really deals with the Department of Planning's response to issues raised during that public exhibition period has been discussed with the impacted councils on a one-on-one basis throughout May. Now, that policy refinement paper isn't a public document, but there was nothing prohibiting council from publishing it, so it's actually on council's website as an attachment to a report to an extraordinary meeting about a month ago. And the provisions in relation to the low and mid-rise housing SEP are expected to come into play sometime from July onwards. The dates there have originally started out somewhere towards October, but they've gradually been brought forward as time goes. Now, in terms of what was exhibited, and I'll generally refer to what was exhibited unless I say otherwise, because the housing refinement paper does change some of the provisions that were put on exhibition back in December, January. But generally speaking, the mid-rise part of that was 400 metres from nominated stations. That's the mixed use and E1 zones. It was buildings up to 21 metres. Generally in the order of 6 to 7 stories. You could, in some, depending on your configuration, you could squeeze in 7 stories, and it was up to floor space ratio of 3 to 1. In terms of medium density developments in the R3 zones, that was heights up to 21 metres, also 6 to 7 stories, again 3 to 1. And beyond that, in the 400 to 800 metre radius from stations, it was 4 to 5 stories, 2 to 1. And in the R3 zones, it was 4 to 5 stories, 2 to 1. Now, the low-rise elements of the proposal at the time, the EIE, on R2 land was within that 800 metre zone. It was townhouses and terraces up to 9.5 metres, 0.7 to 1 floor space ratio. Manor houses, 0.95 or 9.5 metres again, up to 0.8 to 1. And on all R2 land, which is your normal residential house lot, dual occupancies, 9.5 metres, 0.65 to 1 floor space ratio, minimum lot size of 450 square metres, and a minimum frontage width of 12 metres. Now, what that means in terms of low density housing, so there's your train station sites, your low and mid-rise stations, there's your Todd stations, that's St Ives. So it allows the R2 zones where you can do dual occupancies, all of the stuff in yellow. Now that's, I think that's up at St Ives Chase somewhere, so that's commonly what you might see in the current low density housing zones in Ku-ring-gai at the moment. That's what it would look from the air. Plenty of tree cover, dwellings under the canopy, garden setting, which is what everybody knows and loves here. And that's effectively what your dual occupancies allow. So it's a complete change of typology, built much closer to the street, not a lot of space for landscaping of any kind, let alone large canopy trees. Now, eventually that would effectively become the predominant, depending on your amount of take-up, your predominant streetscape typology. Now, in terms of the manor house element of the low rise, that's within 800 metres of your train stations and St Ives. It would be allowable in the zones around blue. Now, that's a manor house just down the back of Gordon here. 2 on 2, or 2 on top of 2. Again, quite generous landscaping. Under the provisions of the SEP, you're looking at a typology more like that. You may or may not, in fact, get a lot of private internal courtyard space, but certainly much closer to the street. So that's effectively what the SEP allows under its current typology. Where are we now? Townhouses and terrace houses. Also in that 800 metres of the train station sites and St Ives. So again, quite a large footprint where you can do that type of development where you can't do it now. So that's some existing townhouse development from down at the old Screen Australia side. I think that one is from down in what's that? That's West Linfield, I suppose you'd call that, down Eaton Roadway. But that's the style of development that you can do under the Todd SEP. So not quite so generous in the landscaping, much narrower frontages, not a lot of on-site car parking. Now, in terms of the residential flat component buildings of the lower mid-rise, again, it was exhibited at that 6 to 7 stories, and it included shop-top housing in the commercial areas of the Wahroonga, Pymble, Turramurra and St Ives. So that's the donut around those centres. Now that's currently medium density high-rise buildings in Ku-ring-gai. That's that 5-storey typology with 50% site cover. Again, allows quite generous plantings, particularly over time. You see that particularly up north around Warrawee, where some of the earlier developments, you're getting quite large canopy trees developed after 10 or 12 years. Now under the under the low and mid-rise housing SEP, effectively right on the street, not a lot of space for tree planting or landscaping of any type, let alone canopy cover. So again, quite a significant change from medium density housing as we've been traditionally doing in Ku-ring-gai. So as I alluded to, the policy refinement paper was released for limited discussion with council stakeholders, and it reflects changes that may or may not be made to the minister. And that was this further consultation with councils, which may or may not lead to further refinement of the provisions. So that's why I've chosen not to map those or detail them in too much, or outline them in too much detail tonight, because they may in fact change. Now the idea of the refinement paper was to collaborate more with councils. There was some discussion about whether the standards of the low and mid-rise SEP as exhibited should apply in fact to the commercial zones at all. And there was some exclusions around hazards, flooding. There was a recalibration of the floor space and height combinations, particularly for the mid-rise developments. And previously, the low and mid-rise SEP effectively required what's known as the apartment design guidelines to be rewritten, and the policy or the recalibration of height and floor space has led to you now, it looks like, having to consider but not necessarily implement the apartment design guidelines, where previously they would have had to be completely rewritten. Now in the policy refinement paper, there is no reference to the low-rise typologies at all, which is the the manor houses and the dual occupancies. So the inference there is that the Department of Planning and Housing is happy with the policy as it was exhibited, i.e. that was a 0.65 to 1 for dual occupancies, the 12 metre frontage and minimum 450. Now the logic in excluding what I referred to previously as the shop top housing within the centres was that on average across Sydney, the standards, height and floor space standards across Sydney in the areas affected by the low and mid-rise housing SEP were already more than what was in the SEP itself. So that was 0.16 to 1 and 20 metre height, and overall it was only 5.5% of the land. So the government looks like it might take the view that those zones represent an area where councils should do their own master planning over time. So in the Ku-ring-gai case, both our height and our floor space in those commercial zones, E1, E2 and ME1, are generally speaking considerably lower than those. So we would expect that some attention will come to us reasonably quickly to go and plan those commercial centres, notwithstanding that the policy looks like it won't apply. Now in terms of a simple tabulation, this is the EIE, the policy as it was exhibited, and these are the equivalent standards that look like they've dropped out of the policy refinement paper. So for example, for residential flat buildings in the R4, E3, or R4, R3 zones within 0 to 400 metres of stations and centres, was exhibited at 21, goes up to 22 for residential buildings, goes up to 24 for shop top housing. What was 3 to 1 is now down at 2.2 to 1, and where this was 6 or 7 stories, it's now capped at 6 stories. Now these are all subject to the way the policy is finally documented and gazetted, but a little bit of recalibration. So heights go up, floor space goes down, and the maximum number of dwellings is capped. For residential flat buildings in the R4 and R3 zones, in that 400 to 800 metre radius from centres, was exhibited at 16, goes up to 17 and a half. No change to the minimum frontage, minimum lot size. Floor space was exhibited at 2 to 1, and it looks like that may drop to 1.5 to 1. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and I did have trouble explaining this to people before, so I hopefully have improved my delivery. What the policy talks about is station precincts and town centre precincts, and there's different ways of measuring your radiuses from each of those depending on what you are. Now, the other thing that came out of the policy refinement paper was some unusual descriptions of the 4 town centre precincts. So the policy refinement paper talks about the Gordon Shopping Mall, it talks about the Lindfield Shops, it talks about the St Ives Shopping Village, and it talks about the Turramurra Shops. Now, I'm sure lots of people have got a different understanding of what those things are, but I don't understand the Gordon Shopping Mall to apply to the whole of Gordon. And I don't understand the St Ives Shopping Village to apply to the whole of the St Ives Shopping Precinct. I would say that is the village itself, and that is the Gordon Shopping Centre across the road. Now, this becomes quite important when you start to work out where you're measuring your distances from. So I've got a couple of examples, and hopefully I can explain that. Now, on top of that, there is also the station precincts, which is a dot in the centre of a train station, measuring from all of the train station locations, which is, people should pretty much understand what that is. It's 400 metres from the train station. Now, I just went through that. That was a neater way of my clunky way of describing it. But what we did seek advice from the department on is where you're going to measure it from, whether the centres are going to be mapped, and whether the radiuses from which you measure from your commercial areas are in fact going to be mapped. Now, the answer to that was, yes, we're going to map it, the commercial area, but we're not necessarily going to map the walkable catchments from the edge of those commercial boundaries, and they may well have to be calculated on a DA by DA, case by case basis. Now, what that looks like in the case of Gordon is your MU1 zone, your commercial zone, effectively goes from that Wide Road, Motorway Road intersection all the way through to St John's Avenue, whereas some people in the room might think that first description of the Gordon Shopping Mall was a smaller precinct here. So is it the precinct, the core of Gordon that has shops? Is it the extension of Gordon where there's really no shops or services? Is it the whole thing, or is it the Gordon Shopping Mall? So that's an important point to clarify, because your 400s and your 800s are effectively get measured from the edge of whichever boundary you're talking about. So it's quite extensive depending on what's in and what's out, and that appears not to have been clarified at that point in time. Now, in terms of the criteria for including stations and centres in the SEP itself, we're looking for trains, not necessarily all of these things, but we're looking for a train frequency of at least 1 every 30 minutes. We're looking at a proximity to major centres of less than 30 minutes. When the EIE was exhibited over Christmas, it was 30 minutes to Sydney CBD only. So the refinement paper has now added North Sydney and Chatswood, which effectively potentially allows more centres to be caught. There was a fairly loose description of a full-line supermarket that has now been nailed down to a supermarket that's got 2,000 square metres retail floor area. And in terms of a bus service, you're looking at least 1 bus an hour. Now, for those people waiting for a bus for an hour, they may not necessarily think that was a good criteria, but that's the criteria. Now, the other exclusions or issues that could have allowed to exclusion was essential infrastructure, water, sewage, stormwater. Road infrastructure is an issue that's been raised with a lot of councillors and the staff. Effectively, the Department of Planning has said all the things that might be important to people in this room aren't necessarily criteria that would allow to exclusion of any centre. We've talked about the train service, we've talked about the bus service. So the criteria for excluding particular stations or centres wasn't particularly rigorous. And I mean, anyone who's familiar with a station like Kalara, for example, there's probably not much chance that they'll ever have a supermarket of 2,000 square metres under the SEPs as they've been gazetted at the present time, or look like being gazetted. So, at a high level, what this means for Ku-ring-gai, we're talking about nearly 24,000 dwellings are potentially impacted by the low and mid-rise housing set. We're talking about potential new dwellings of nearly 100,000, and this is assuming 100% take-up. So you wouldn't necessarily get that over time. You might get somewhere in the order of 65, 70% take-up, depending on the topology and your location. The TOD dwellings, all we've used there is the 4,500 average per TOD site that the government has effectively alluded to in a number of documents. That gives you another 18. So we're talking about extra dwellings in the order of 120 and upwards of 250 odd, 280,000 new residents. So it's a completely different Ku-ring-gai to the one that people currently live in. Now, in terms, I've got a couple of maps to go through. These are ward-centric briefings. So there's in fact 3 stations or commercial areas that fall into Gordon Ward. So I'll cover Pymble, Kalara and Gordon, and I'll switch these out for the next couple of briefing sessions. Now, all of these will go up on the website probably tomorrow. Going to get them all. Yep. We'll make these available so you don't have to take photos of them. We'll put them on the website. The only thing that will change will be a couple of maps. We'll take questions at the end if we can, thanks. So in terms of Gordon, so these numbers apply to the whole of Gordon. I'll just jump forward to Kalara. What we've done in Kalara is excluded Gordon and we've excluded Linfield. So when I come to Kalara, it's only the area in darker purple. If you're talking about 620 odd buildings, dwellings that are impacted, net new dwellings at 100% take-up of 3,448. Within the TOD itself, another 4,000. So you're talking in the order of between 16,500 and 17,000 new residents for Gordon. What it means for Kalara, just in that dark purple area, 652 dwellings, net new dwellings in the lower mid-rise housing set, which is the donut, of about 3,031, and then that 4,500 in the Kalara TOD area itself. And for Pymble, and we've got that in because the wall boundaries are there, so most of it's outside of Gordon Ward, just that little strip there. But again, you're talking 740 impacted dwellings, potential net increase 4,833 dwellings, and new residents about 10,150. So again, quite a potential increase over time. This is just summarising those exclusions, the levels of service, buses, supermarkets, some land constraints which Council spent a lot of time or focus on in its submission on the SEP because Council wasn't necessarily happy with the way that the government had dealt with those exclusions. Now these are the key ones for us: bushfire, flood and other hazards. So Council wasn't happy that enough bushfire-prone land was excluded from the policy. In terms of flood, probable maximum flood we didn't think was acceptable, and it applies in a couple of catchments. Well, it only applies to the Hawkesbury and the Nepean, not the Sydney Harbour catchment. Some evacuation issues which everyone would be aware of. They largely dovetail with the flooding and the bushfire and just general hazards. In terms of heritage impacts, this has been a big focus of Council's TOD presentation or TOD submissions. So between the two SEPs, there's about 4,000 dwellings, either in HCAs or individually listed. 3,000 of those would be within 800 metres of the train stations, and of that 2,000 are within the 4 southern TOD stations. So even if you take out the 4 TOD stations, you're still talking 2,000 dwellings apply in the low and mid-rise housing SEP area. No surprise to everybody that the heritage of Ku-ring-gai is largely focused up and down the train line. It was a function of when they were built, when the train stations were built. Going to cover biodiversity a little bit. 7 endangered communities, 2 critically endangered, that's the stiff and the blue gum high forest, the turpentine ironbark forest. 700 plant species, 300 vertebrates, a couple of invertebrates. So you've got quite a diverse ecology up here in Ku-ring-gai. That would be significantly challenged under particularly take-up of the low and mid-rise housing set. Increased hard surfaces will contribute to degradation of downstream water flows. And you've got, particularly going east-west, you've got some islands or corridors, stepping stones for wildlife to travel from national parks in the east to national parks in the west. They will largely be disrupted significantly under anything more than relatively low take-up in the low and mid-rise housing set. So this probably brings it home. 2022 Council did an urban forest strategy. It was aiming for canopy cover across the LGA, and this excludes national parks, of between 45 and 49%. Now the purple is trees that are on private land. So at the moment you've got 50% of canopy cover in Ku-ring-gai occurs on private land, and that is largely, not exclusively, but largely in the low and mid-rise housing SEP area. The TOD areas there's still a bit of good canopy cover there, but it's certainly not as significant as the low and mid-rise housing SEP would affect. So what that means, again, busy slide, it'll be on the website, but particularly down in the, this is the low mid-rise housing SEP, you're looking at 100% development in the R2 zone. This is the manor houses and the dual occupancies. The loss of in the order of 32,000 trees at 100% take up, the loss of 16,000 trees at 50% take up, and the loss of 8,000 odd trees at 25% development take up. Again, this is the bushfire prone land at the fringe on the national parks. And you've got buffer areas including another 100 metres in from that. So council doesn't think that those things have been adequately considered in the SEP. Back on the canopy cover, the targets in the SEP itself for dual occupancies is as low as between 15 and 25%, where council was looking for somewhere in the order of 45 to 49. Now the 45 to 49 isn't a ridiculous target. It's a target that successive state governments have had for the metropolitan area of Sydney. And under the SEP as drafted, it's highly unlikely you will ever get anywhere near those targets. And there's no requirement in the SEP to actually retain existing vegetation. So on demolition day, you could have not a single tree on site, and your 15 to 25% canopy cover is planted back after development. And in some dense or development typologies, you will never get the large canopy trees that currently exist in particularly the R2 zones. We also say that the policy doesn't adequately reflect, the ridgetop nature of development in Ku-ring-gai, and particularly the steep topography. And we would say that there is significant risk of increased urban heat, which the canopy targets were designed to alleviate and minimise. Not going to dwell on this one too much, because you can get sucked down a rabbit hole on transport. But at the moment, the shadings of reds and pinks here shows you the density of development. Now, at the moment, it's largely, not exclusively, but largely focused on the highway and railway corridor. Now, by allowing large amounts of development outside of the corridor, you're effectively condemning people to have to jump in a car to get to heavy transport down the corridor. So not only have you increased development around particularly the TOD sites and the other train stations, you're requiring everybody else outside to get into that corridor for rapid transit. Again, this slide will go up. There's some speaker notes goes with it, but that's effectively the gist of it. We've been focusing development to this point down the corridor for obvious reasons, but now with increased development sporadically all over the place outside of the corridor, that makes things harder for people there and there alike. A lot of talk of documents being cabinet in conference, being secret. it appears to us there's no traffic impact at all for any local government area on how the tight and the low and mid-rise SEP would impact, other than, you know, the requirement for a train. Just in the train stations alone, with the extra development in the 400 to 800 metre radiuses, that's the equivalent of having 2 new full-line supermarkets in each town centre. So we're not talking, you know, small movements. We're talking quite significant movements, and they wouldn't be the 2,000 square metre supermarket. It's the order of a 3,500 square metre supermarket. So lots of traffic. In Gordon alone, we had done some testing as part of our town centre work a couple of years ago. Even with all of the traffic improvements that we built into the contributions plan at that time, there was only capacity for 2,500 new dwellings. Within the road corridor, you know, what's known as the easement, there's actually very little room capacity for extra lanes, turning, traffic lights, whatever it is. You know, to accommodate traffic of the nature we're talking about, you don't effectively have to put an extra lane on each side of the specific highway, which is not going to happen. It's not necessarily reasonable to expect that everyone's going to jump in the car or jump on a train for all of their movements. People do like cars, particularly up here. Lots of cars, lots of kids. You do tend to own less cars if you're living in a unit close to the train station, but if you're out in the low and mid-rise area, you're certainly going to have as many cars as you ever did. Now, in terms of the work we've done to date, over about a 15-year period, we've delivered 25,000 square metres of new parks, 7 new parks in total, a couple more in progress of acquisition. Under the new regime of property pricing that's come about through the tight and the low and mid-rise housing set, it's getting increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for council to buy any new properties for any new parks. So it may be that the parks you have are the only parks you're going to get under a new development scenario. So there'll be increasing pressure for the limited open space that we've got. In terms of broader community facilities, the community facility strategy we did back in 2018, at that time found we had a shortfall of 10,000 square metres of library and community space. Under the types of increases we're now talking about, that 10,000 square metre shortfall blows out to a 33 to 40,000 square metre shortfall in community space. Again, increasingly difficult to actually buy land for. Stormwater and sewer, don't want to go down that drain hole too much tonight, but for anyone who's experienced relatively short periods of flash flooding in Ku-ring-gai, you'd know that the stormwater system really only caters for about that 5% event of 1 in 20, as people used to refer to it as. So there's certain capacity issues. This is a January to January figure, but Sydney Water itself had self-reported 50 sewer leaks within their own system. Apparently that's fit for purpose. So both of those are quite significant issues, that particularly this one, which will fall on council, the stormwater system. We're still trying to get to grips with exactly what the extent of that issue is. In terms of flood mapping, we haven't done flood mapping for all of the tide areas yet, let alone all of the catchments. We were doing one a year, so we've still got about 8 to go, I think, on that. Now, I did talk about the non-refusal standards. So the predominant or preeminent provisions in the state policy are height and floor space. So our legal advice, our independent legal advice, basically says that any of the other provisions of our LEP and DCP that talk about local character, amenity, heritage, biodiversity, if they stop someone achieving height and floor space, they are of no or limited effect. Now, I suspect that those issues will be played out in court over the next couple of years, and we'll find out exactly what the relationship is. But at the moment, the TODCEP, which has been gazetted, does not call up council's DCP provisions at all, and we see no reason why the low and mid-rise SEP wouldn't be drafted exactly the same way, which makes it very hard to say that there will be an ordinary merit assessment of council's ordinary planning controls on these developments, because height and floor space are the preeminent ones. That is the end of the formal presentation. Happy to take questions.
everyone. So now we'll get to questions. We've got 2 people with mics, so we'll have front people and back people, one each in turns. So there's this man here, Will.
Thank you. Yep, thank you. I'm just wondering if you could reiterate that last statement, because that is the nuts of so much of what's going to occur. Could I trouble you to do that? And then, as a second bite, what will prevail? Will the Todd prevail over mid to high rise, in that the Todd is already hatched and each of the dwellings that are affected, the allotments that are affected, are known? So, excuse me for having 2 bites at the cherry.
That's okay, and I might defer to the corporate lawyer if I get myself into trouble. So at the moment, when council considered the Todd development back in, I think it was early February, doesn't matter, we put our legal advice on the website at that point in time, and it basically said that it was going to be very hard for council to enforce these things because the Todd SEP prevailed in respect of height and floor space. And in fact, if you look at the policy objective, which is to have 4,500 dwellings in each of the Todd stations, that policy fails if these things predominate over height and floor space. The policy only works if those things are the major determinants of new building developments. At the moment, we haven't seen the final form of the low and mid-rise housing set, but the Todd provisions have been enacted, started operating on the 13th of March. Sorry, I've got to talk to the mic. 13th of May. So technically people can lodge DAs now based on the Todd set. And very scant on detail. It's height and floor space. Did I miss anything, Mr. Corporate Lawyer?
Hello everyone, my name's Jamie Taylor. I'm the in-house lawyer at the council. So what Mr. Watson has just said is really quite right. What is going to occur here is that the SEPs will prevail over the local planning controls to the extent that the local planning controls are inconsistent, and as Mr. Watson said, the main area of inconsistency is going to be around height and floor space. Now there can be very complex legal arguments about inconsistency, but as a rule of thumb, I think you can take it that wherever the local controls would have the effect of preventing someone achieving the SEP controls in terms of height or floor space, they're going to be found to be inconsistent. And I think the other aspect of the question that was asked was what's the interaction of the Todd and the low and mid rise when it comes in. That's not something we can give a very precise answer about, but I think what you can expect will be that people seeking to develop land that is covered by both those policies will probably get the best of both worlds. They can basically nominate which controls, which policy they're relying on for their development, and there might be arguments about one set prevailing over the other, but I wouldn't really expect that to play a big part of the big picture in terms of what you can expect to see happening.
Thank you. Yes, that man there.
Hi, thanks for the information tonight. What's the objective of the council's legal challenge? Is it to remove the Todd and the SEP, or is it to bring back some control over planning? What's the
Get that answer.
the claim you're effectively making?
So where we are at the moment is council has commenced proceedings in the Land Environment Court. They're challenging the validity of the Todd SEP because that's the one that's been purported to have been made at this time. We're watching and observing what occurs with the low and mid rise. just in terms of what the proceedings are about, it's important to understand that we can't ask the court to, enter into the policy merits of the SEP. The court will not take on a legislative role. Approaching the court and saying this is a bad policy, please change it, that's not going to get us anywhere at all. Now, the TOD is the SEPs are what's known as delegated legislation. So it's not legislation that's gone through the Parliament, but it's rules that have been enacted as a result of powers that are given in acts of Parliament. So the SEPs are things that are promulgated or made under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. And in essence, a state environmental planning policy is made by the Governor on recommendation of the Planning Minister. The Act does lay down some procedures that need to be followed to make a SEP, and it's our view that those procedures haven't been followed correctly, and that has led to grounds for the court to find that the policy is actually invalid. A lot of that is to do with consultation. The Act doesn't lay down specific requirements for consultation, but it does impose requirements to make decisions about what consultation to carry out. And it's the council's case that some of those decisions weren't made, or if they were made, they were made in a way that's not legally valid. There are a number of grounds challenging the validity in relation to the process. Now, I'm pleased to say we got advice from the court today that the Chief Judge has given us permission to publish the summons, and so that has this afternoon gone up on our website. So anyone's interested in the detail of our case, it's all there on our website.
Sorry, was that for the TOD or for the SEP?
That's all in relation to the TOD. As I said, the SEP hasn't been, the low and mid-rise SEP has not been made yet, so we don't have anything to challenge yet.
Anyone from here? Yes, over there.
In relation to the 400 and 800 metre measurements, the diagrams seem to imply it's as the crow flies, but then you've also mentioned walking distance. Which is correct, or isn't it exactly that simple?
I've tried to represent it diagrammatically in a consistent way, but we would say there's disclaimers on this until the actual SEP is published. Because you're right, as the crow flies is going to be different, quite often in some cases by hundreds of metres in Ku-ring-gai, simply because of the large, deep nature of blocks. So that's why I put a couple of caveats around the maps, and why I had a bit of obviously unclear discussion around where you measure from. Until we actually see a SEP, I've tried to be intentionally vague, but in most cases it is highly likely that it may well be a bigger area of impact than what I've shown on these maps. It's unlikely that it's going to be less than what's on these maps. So when I give you these numbers here, that's probably on the low end of assumptions. So until we see an actual map, all we had from the department was clarification that they were, where is it? They were going to map the centres, but they were not going to map the 400 and 800 metre distances from that. Now it's likely to be walking distance, yes. Okay.
Excuse me, thanks for the information. Has there been any discussion with council with state government on potentially to look at taking away the arbitrary nature of the 400 or 800 metres to be more consistent with actually either roads, landscapes that might make it a bit more amenable, rather than putting a line straight through a road and then potentially destroying heritage areas.
I think in terms of the low and mid-rise housing set, we're probably not at that point yet. But what we saw with the gazettal of the Todd set was that the area was extended rather than reduced. So where you mapped out your 400 metre radius from your train stations there, blocks were extended to include extra properties rather than reduced back in. There was, if we go to, it's not, I might have it at the end. Roseville. It's my understanding, goes to your point, that a little bit of the 400 metre radius from Roseville goes into Chatswood, and that has been excluded. Now that's probably the exception rather than the rule, but around the state you'll see little deviations from the norm like that, which goes in some way to acknowledge your point, but largely it's going to be more expansive than less expansive is the short answer to your question.
Yes, there. Thanks, Phil.
Could you just clarify the projected increases in population and dwellings? The time period for that is 15 years or 20 years? These.
I think they've been described more recently as targets. Now I would say in the case of Ku-ring-gai they're not targets because one set of controls have been turned off and another set have been turned on. So our dwelling target for the 5-year period was, 7,500 dwellings. But the dwelling pipeline doesn't turn off when you reach 7,500, it keeps going. Normally with a target you would build it in at the beginning of the planning process. You might add a 25% redundancy. If you're looking to provide 7,500, for example, you might build in 10,000, knowing full well that you'd only get about a 75% take up. So there's, what is there? I think at the moment there's 39 stage 2 TODs. Only, I think 7 of them have been turned on and 4 of those are in Ku-ring-gai. So the 7 that have already been turned on, you probably couldn't call them a target, whereas for all the other councils that have had the opportunity to try and influence the way their TODs are reflected on the ground, they might genuinely be called a target. So the 7,500 we've got is over 5 years, but when we met with the Minister, he said, we won't be turning these things off in 5 years because the housing affordability problem won't be solved in 5 years. So they're really more likely just forecasts of what the government would like to see. Conveniently, if you take the, go back to the first slide, for example, all the targets that were allocated to people publicly in the last couple of weeks conveniently add up to the number that the state has to provide under the National Housing Accord. Now, there's no way you can necessarily guarantee you're going to get all of those, some of those, or whether they're going to be in the right place. And nationally, I think that the target's changed a bit now. I think it's, 1.2 million over 5 years. So all the targets conveniently add up to, in our state's case, 377,000 being the 5-year target for the state.
I still didn't, I'm not clear. So if you go to the Ku-ring-gai total forecast, if you're saying 7,500 is for the next 5 years, then the 260,000 new residents, what period is that projection for?
Now we've assumed there that was 100% take up of all of the dwellings in the low and mid-rise housing area. So that one. So the policies when they came out had, I think, a 15-year time horizon on them. Now I don't think you're necessarily ever going to get to 100% take up, but theoretically that's what the government expects the policy to deliver in the life of the policy. Now, it may be, well, like I say, that we're turning on controls, we're not turning them off when you reach targets or milestones or whatever it is. So theoretically, the development pipeline is subject to market, and whenever it turns on or turns up, it's available.
Where's the mic? Sorry, can't see well. Someone over here?
Thank you so far. Just going back to that last question then, can you put it in perspective, say how many new dwellings Ku-ring-gai's had over the last 10 or 15 years and how this compares? Is it it sounds like it's going to be a massive change. Is it going to be twice as fast, twice as many, or slow, or?
I think we worked out over a 20-year period, average Ku-ring-gai had provided about 500 a year. So
500 dwellings a year.
Yeah, so somewhere between 5 and 20,000 in the last 5, 10, 20 years, depending on what your timeline is. So this is it's more than what we've ever done in a 5-year period. We would never get anywhere near 7.5, let alone, if we delivered 2.5, somewhere between 2.5 to 5,000. It's always lumpy depending on the market, but 2.5 to 5,000 over a 5 to 10 year period would be all you'd get. So this is significantly more than what we've seen in the past.
So one down the back there.
If you own a property in the affected areas...
Sorry, could you just speak up into the mic a bit more? Thanks.
If you own a property in the affected areas, it's just gone off. What's likely to happen, or what's the process of acquiring our property for these new developments?
I don't think we can really answer that. It's really about what the real estate market will do and who approaches who and how it works in particular streets. Like, for example, in Roseville, we know that there's been a number of houses sold as one package for development, so it would just depend on the process that might just pop up in your street. Sorry, we can't be any more helpful on that one.
Could you just go back to the planning one where it shows the R2 currently, like E1 and R4, the coloured map? I've got a question on that. So
That one? Or
no, it's the current. Yeah, for everywhere. You showed R2. It was mainly R2, but R3. It was at the beginning somewhere. That one. So for 400 to 800 metres, the way it's written and what you've explained is if it's currently R2, all you can build on that is 2-storey residence within the 800 metres, which is like manor houses, dual ox terraces. But if it's currently zoned R4, R3 or E1, then you can build up to 6 or 7 storeys. Is that correct?
it really depends on the final form of the policy, but that's pretty close to the way we understand it at the moment, yes.
So all the stuff that's R2, which is the majority of stuff outside of that, they can't build anything above 2 storeys without you rezoning it.
You can do townhouses and dual occupancies and manor houses.
But they're only 2 storeys.
9.5 metres is effectively 3. It will give you a third story
Okay.
in an attic.
So when you go this big 800 metres, you're not going to have 6 and 7-storey buildings outside of this. Even within the 400 metres, the Todd, if it's R2 today, you can only still build 9.5 metres.
No. If it's in the Todd, you get straight to 6 stories.
Okay, but 4 to 800, it'll only be 9.5 metres. Okay.
Now, when the low and mid-rise SEP was originally exhibited, it didn't include the R4 sites, it was only the R3. But the government's since come to the conclusion that lots of people have R4 standards lower than what you would have got on an R3 site under the Todd SEP, the low and mid-rise housing SEP. So that's now been rolled in. But like I say, we really need to see the final version of the SEP itself. There's been some refinements in the refinement paper, and we expect there'll be some more come out of it. So that's why I'm a little bit vague, because I'm trying to bounce between what was exhibited, what's been discussed in the refinement paper, and what might actually be gazetted. And depending on when you see a Todd SEP, a low and mid-rise housing SEP, I might be changing this PowerPoint presentation between this forum and the last one in July. The Housing Accord starts from the 1st of July, and our last presentation is that day, so I might be giving a slightly different presentation in 3 weeks' time.
Okay, someone from the back now.
I was just wondering, with the height requirements, is that measured from street level or from the highest altitude of a certain block?
I might look to the Brains Trust on the bench here. If I get this wrong, they'll pull me up. It's natural height level. So across a site, a sloping site, it is measured at different points across a site. So, if 6 metres from there, 6 metres from there, or 6 metres from there would cause you to step a building down a site. So it varies depending on the topography of the site.
So I think there's someone over here. Oh no, sorry, the man behind him. Yeah.
I think the short answer to all of those questions is no. You're not obliged to do any of those things. What you may find is that some of your neighbours sell and you end up with a 6-storey building or a 3-storey building or something different next to you or in your street. But you are compelled to do nothing, no.
Yep, that's right. Where are we up to? The back? No? Yes? Okay, sorry. Just taking a while to get there. Yeah, come to you next.
Thank you, Andrew. I just want to clarify. Heritage listed house can foreseeably have 6-storey or 7-storey buildings on 3 sides. Is that correct?
The short answer to that question, Harry, is yes. Heritage houses are dealt with differently to everything else in the Todd SEP. We expect that will be the same in the low and mid-rise housing SEP, and that will probably be one of the more contentious issues that might find its way through the court system in time. But yes, in the Todd SEP in particular, the heritage properties themselves, individually listed items, are excluded. They're not mapped as part of that policy, no.
Yes, just that man.
I just wanted to ask if you had anything to say about the dual occupancy provisions, and particularly if you could clarify the minimum lot size. I presume that's after subdivision.
450 after subdivision? Yeah. No, it's 450 prior to subdivision, so you can cut the 450 in half. Yep. What we're trying to do today is really just give you the facts rather than our opinions of various elements of the policy.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for tonight. I've got two questions actually. The first one is, you mentioned that the developers could flatten the block clean, take all the trees out and then just plant their own trees afterwards. Does that mean that the tree heritage doesn't count anymore? And the second question is about setbacks. What's the story with setbacks on the different areas?
This goes to that last slide that I talked about, which was the non-refusal provisions. So neither of the SEPs calls up council's DCP or LEP, other than height and floor space provisions in the SEP itself. So those things would have to be effectively argued on merit. So there are effectively in the SEPs so far that we've seen no setbacks, frontages, things like that. Last slide. Non-refusal. Yeah, so the SEP itself only has floor space and height standards, and we don't expect that the TOD SEP doesn't call up council's DCP at the moment. We don't expect the low and mid-rise housing SEP to do the same. So all of those things would effectively be argued on merit.
Thank you for that. Now, no more down the back. Is there that I can see? Well, I'm just going to take one for the back in a minute.
Just two questions. Could you repeat the number of trees, and I would imagine they're large trees that will be removed? There was a figure. Could you just repeat that? That's the first question. The second question is this going to provide affordable housing?
These are theoretical calculations that we've done on, and these are the same slides we presented, same numbers we presented back in January. We've got no reason to think these are exaggerated in any way, but you're talking somewhere between 8,000 and 32,000 trees lost just in the low and mid-rise. There are two developments. So yeah, there is no provision in the SEP to retain your existing trees on site. And I mean, we all know when we go to do even a minor extension into our house that trees are always in a genuinely inconvenient location. They're never located at the sides, the front, the back. They're stuck right in the middle. So worst case scenario is if you're building a dual occupancy that's got 0.65 to 1 floor space ratio, you're going to hard pave most of the site. So your existing trees are likely to be in the wrong place, unfortunately. Now, there'll be some instances where you will be able to retain trees, but again, this is development by development, site by site issue to be resolved. It's going to be hard to keep a lot of, particularly large trees. When you're looking at canopy cover targets for dual occupancies of, in the order of 15%, they're not going to be large canopy trees that we currently see through Ku-ring-gai, 15, 20 metres. They'll be, more medium size, 6, 8 story metres rather than the larger trees we're used to. Affordable housing. There is in the TODs, there is a minimum 2% affordable housing, which would be managed by a community housing trust. Now, they only kick in once your gross floor area gets to a certain level, and I think from memory it was roughly about 2,000 square metres. So that's to ensure that you get at least one apartment in each development. Some developments, if they don't hit the threshold, they won't be providing any at all. There's some separate provisions under the housing SEP that came in, I think the 13th of December last year, where there's in fact bonuses if you provide, you can get 30% height and floor space bonuses if you provide a certain amount of affordable housing, again, to be managed by a community housing trust. Now, where I've talked about 6 and 7 stories through this, and floor space ratios of 3 to 1 or 2.5 to 1, you could technically go from a 7-storey building to a 10-storey building under all of the scenarios I've talked about if you provide that affordable housing. Now, the difference between the two SEPs, and we're getting right into the weeds here, is that the 2% under the TOD SEP is in perpetuity, and the housing, affordable housing under the other SEP that gives you the bonuses is only for 15 years. So some of your affordable housing, while it gets you a 3-storey bonus, would only be available for a community housing trust to manage for 15 years. And the other part of the question is, I mean, there's a difference between affordable housing and housing affordability. Is this likely to mend or lead to cheaper housing? Well, the answer is probably no, it won't. Certainly not in the short term. The market will work that out over time. There will be feasibilities issues across the whole of Sydney, but if there's anywhere in Sydney you can make your feasibility stack up for these types of developments, it's probably up here. But that doesn't make it affordable.
Okay, so yes, Phil.
I may have misunderstood it, but is it hypothetically, are you saying that the heritage houses are not included? And if they aren't, is it possible you could have a heritage house stuck between two 6-storey buildings, which in my view defeats the purpose of maintaining the heritage for a house like that?
The answer to that question is theoretically yes, you could end up with a heritage house stuck between two 6-storey buildings.
What is the council doing about that? Because it's somewhat unfair on the owners of a heritage house to find themselves in that position.
I don't disagree with that. I'm just here giving you the policy as it's being gazetted or presented, but that is certainly one of the perverse impacts of the policy, yes.
My question was, what is the council going to do about that? Because it's somewhat unfair on the owner of a heritage house to find himself in that position. Have you considered that, and are you going to be doing something about that? Because it seems to me that in the zeal to protect the heritage house, if these policies do get through, then the owners of heritage houses are going to suffer. And we are also members of the council. I am taking it up. Thank you.
I don't think there's a lot I can say to that tonight. It's certainly an issue that both the council staff and the councillors are aware of. But in terms of the TOD SEP, that scenario already exists. The individually listed heritage items are excluded from that policy, so they're not mapped. So that, you know, I hate to defer to somebody else, but that's really an issue that should be taken up with the planning minister, the premier, your local members as soon as possible, because particularly in the case of the low and mid-rise SEP, it hasn't been gazetted yet. So it's really a matter that's got to be fed into the policy development pipeline.
So one from the back. Thanks, Will. And then I'll come back to you, and then I'll go over here.
Hello. Thank you for tonight. I just wanted to ask a quick question. With the urgent critical infrastructure required for the extra 282,000 new residents in the area, who pays for that? Is that the ratepayer, the developer, state government, council, or is it a combination of all four, or federal government?
At the present time, it's fair to say that those issues are still being sorted out. There is a state levy that will apply to of $10,000 or thereabouts, depending on your dwelling type, for state infrastructure. And that's an issue we've explored in a number of meetings with the minister, and it appears none of that money will necessarily flow to council, and that's in the order of a couple of $100 million. The rest of it will fall upon the ratepayers. There will be continued development contributions will flow from this type of development. But by having, at the moment, when you identify development in advance and stage it, you can stage your infrastructure. The worst implications of both these policies is that you can get sort of development occurring all over the place, feeding into what is, undersized pipes and drains all across the LGA, and they all have an impact downstream. So we end up not being able to stage it, not being able to time it, and having demands all over the place. But theoretically, those costs will be covered by the council and future ratepayers to a large measure.
Thank you. Now I have this man here, Will. No, the one, sorry, in front. No, in front, thanks. I'll come back to you.
You mentioned May the 13th for the Todd. I'm just wondering about a timeline for the low rise.
When the government first put the low rise on exhibition, they were talking about a start date in September, October. That's progressively being brought forward. We've been told sometime from July onwards, so we're just assuming it's the beginning of July because that's the start of the National Housing Accord timeframe. But sometime in July would be our understanding or best guess at the moment.
We've still got a lot of time, so we don't need to worry about everyone's questions getting answered, so it'll be okay.
Listen, I've been a resident of Pimple 42 years. All this mumbo jumbo, and I know that this is going to be a lot of legal problems. There's going to be forms formed to fight this in court from the resident level, not the state. So we take this to court, which will delay all these times of implementation. I'm getting it right. In other words, it's not going to be that smooth because people are not going to take, some of us are not going to take that crap from some politician who's never worked in the real world, okay? And there's only so much.
I'll find a better map. This one, probably not the best map. So council's court action at the moment only relates to the Todd SEP, which is the 400 metres around those southern train stations. So there is currently no, as the corporate lawyer alluded to before, we're keeping a watching eye on the low and mid-rise housing SEP, but there is no legal action that this council has initiated yet in relation to any of the northern train stations or St Ives. It's only for those stations down south. So Pimble isn't covered by the current regulation.
Okay, yes, thank you. It's, yes, I think so. Who wants to answer that question?
It is the case that your land value may well increase, but this might be a good opportunity for me to clarify that council rates as a whole are capped across the whole municipality. So as your land value increases, you don't get a proportional increase in council rates. Land tax, state government land tax does go up proportionally, but ours doesn't because it's capped. So land value for the purpose of council rates is just to distribute the rates amongst properties. So if all land values in the municipality went up the same, everyone's rates would only go up at the rates cap, which in a typical year might be 3%. Look, that may be the case, yeah, but the state government or IPART determines it. but they're usually pretty frugal about our rates increases.
Do we have any more hands? Okay, so, all right, that lady over there? No, you? Yeah.
I've been told that once the property is purchased under the TOD, there are timelines built in, and we would see change happen really rapidly. Could you explain that or clarify?
I think that's really a question for the market. I mean, the TODCEP is already in place. It's open at the moment for people to start putting sites together, amalgamating sites. We haven't had anyone do that yet. But you then got to go through the ordinary development application process. So if someone had a site, had plans, all of that takes time, and then there's time to assess a DA. So it would theoretically not, it wouldn't be unreasonable to say it's 2 years at least before you start to see change on the ground. So, I mean, with the federal government looking for quick wins, lots of those dwellings they're looking for in that 5-year period, if they're not already in the development pipeline, they're coming at the end of the 5-year period rather than existing stuff.
Okay, so is there anyone who hasn't asked a question who'd like to ask a question?
Hi, quick question. Is there any prospect of more houses being heritage?
No, sorry, you'll have to speak up a bit more.
Sure. Is there any prospect of more heritage listed houses being heritage listed as a result of TOD?
At the present time, the answer to that is no. I can't predict the future.
Thank you. This man here, one. Oh.
Thanks. Another question on heritage. You said that items that have been individually listed for local significance will be respected. What happens with heritage precincts, and will they be respected?
The heritage conservation areas are included in the TODCEP, and we expect they will be similarly treated in the low and mid-rise housing SEP. So at the moment, some of those sites we've seen offered for expression of interest down in Roseville, for example, they're largely, if not wholly, within heritage conservation areas. Now, there may be some debate in the courts about whether they appropriately address aesthetics, character, heritage and all the rest of it, but theoretically, if you look at the non-refusal provisions, there's not a lot of weight put to the heritage conservation status of Ku-ring-gai. And that's why we talk in, where are we? This one. I mean, we're talking about Kalara. This is just the TOD. 83% of properties in that 400-metre radius are currently within heritage conservation areas. Now, on the remaining 17%, you're not going to get your 4,500 new dwellings if you're looking at buildings bigger than what you've got in the CBD. Across all of the TODs and the low and mid-rise SEP areas, you've got 4,000 dwellings in HCAs. Only 2,000 of those are in the 4 TOD precincts. So you've got an additional 2,000 buildings that are either outside the in the 400 to 800 in the TODs or up in the other precincts. And most of those are going to be within heritage conservation areas rather than individually listed. So a large proportion of those 4,000 dwellings are effectively at risk.
The state government had said that they would produce some design guidelines as part of the TOD to see if the resolution of these issues to do with the heritage conservation and heritage items and what forms of development might occur in those areas. Is there any timeline for those guidelines to be produced and made public?
Short answer to that question, Andrew, is no. The other thing the state government said they would do is they would produce a toolkit or a pattern book. Now we assume that is to allow, particularly at the low and mid-rise end of the scale, more developments to be dealt with by complying development certificates, for example. So it's to make sure more of those dwellings actually get put into the construction pipeline sooner rather than later. But no, there's no timeline on either of those. But that goes to that last slide about non-refusal standards. It's very hard to tell a developer when he's paid top dollar for a couple of blocks that he can't have 6 stories, he can only have 1 because he's got a heritage building next door. It's not the way the policy is designed to work.
I'd have to look up the transport-oriented development website again, but there are some guidelines on how heritage can be managed within a TOD precinct, but that's a link to a heritage guide from 19 years ago. So that's what I've got from the state government. It's guidelines from 19 years ago, and the guidelines don't cover the scenario of 22 metres tall, floor space ratio 2.5 to 1. They cover all sorts of different scenarios, but not TODs.
Thank you. I think there's one down the back.
I would just like to ask and clarify, what is the ultimate goal that the council want to achieve in the court case?
Okay, thanks.
Really, there's only 2 possible outcomes to the council's proceedings, realistically. One is that the council's not successful and the policy continues. And the other is that the policy is found to be invalid, in which case the local planning controls remain in place. Now, the government obviously has continuing powers to make another SEP, but that would be, another process down the track in possibly in different circumstances. So we can't assume that it would be necessarily Pyrrhic victory to win and then have the exact identical controls put back in place by the government, but that's not impossible.
I might just add something to what the corporate lawyer said. So if the SEP was declared invalid, that would provide time. Earlier, when I opened this evening, I mentioned that council had resolved to explore studies for alternate scenarios in the TODs, so that would provide additional time for that to occur. Also, if the SEP was invalid, perhaps the government would go back and actually do it in accordance with the requirements it was meant to do in the first place. So that might include actually consulting with the community. So perhaps there would be a different outcome.
So I'm going to take questions from people who haven't asked questions. Do we have any more? Oh, can we speak up? Oh, is it on?
Can you clarify the position of trees in the TOD?
I think my earlier comments about trees in the low and mid-rise SEP equally apply to the TOD. But some of the development typologies that you could see in a TOD are effectively 100% site cover. So there are some sites where there will be no requirement to retain any trees at all. And in some cases it will be very difficult to retain large trees. So again, in the TOD, the trees aren't one of the key determinants of the policy. The policy is about height and floor space, and everything else takes secondary or tertiary position. So trees are less important under the TOD and the low and mid-rise housing SEP than they are under any current controls in Sydney, in any council area.
Thank you. Hands for people that haven't spoken.
Thanks. I just have a question again about the heritage conservation zone properties. Currently, we can't, for example, prune a diseased tree, but our neighbour now, I'm told, can build a big ugly apartment. How will council justify having a say in the shape of our letterbox or the shape of our path? Won't the role of council in planning drastically change?
The provisions of the TOD only apply if you're doing the development typologies in the TOD. So if you were still in a heritage house or in a heritage conservation area and you wanted to do a normal DA that you're currently doing, the provisions of council's LEP would apply to that development. But a completely different package of controls would apply if your neighbour wanted to build a 6-storey development next door, yes.
Yeah, Will?
Hello. Given that under the proposals of the TOD that builders are going to be descending on Ku-ring-gai, is there any plans from Ku-ring-gai Council to increase council inspectors as such, illegal cutting of trees, traffic flows, illegal dumping of construction material? We have seen that in the West quite a lot.
Yes, we have started planning for the worst case, I guess, if all of this housing does eventuate. And so there'll be a whole range of additional resources. We will need additional planners to process DAs, but as you mentioned, compliance officers will be very important as well, due to all the additional housing, additional complying development, and of course, additional pressure on tree removal, both legal and illegal.
Thank you. So people who haven't asked a question?
Oh, hi. On one of the slides you had I think it was the boundaries for Roseville. And I'm just wondering, you said that part of Chatswood was excluded, and I was just wondering where the boundary for that exclusion zone starts.
That's the back of the slide deck. I wasn't intending to show tonight. I only showed it to answer another question. That's Boundary Road there. So the 400 metre zone just clips across Boundary Road. It's my understanding that on the other side of Boundary Road, these provisions won't apply. And I'm aware of similar instances all across Sydney where quite small areas fall in somebody else's boundary. I think there's one up between Lane Cove and North Sydney, for example, that might be about the same size, that might be dealt with the same way. But it's the exception rather than the rule. There's not very many of them. So yeah, I've only got these at the back of the deck so that we're doing 5 of these over the next 2 weeks or so, and I'll just switch the maps up so that they're relevant to the presentation I'm giving on the day.
More efficiently done. Any more questions?
I was going to say, has there been any mention of supporting development for all of this new infrastructure coming in, like schools, any talk of new construction on any of these projects, or is that once again to be decided?
Didn't hear that particularly well. I think you're talking about state-provided infrastructure. Schools was the one you were given. There's a whole lot of feasibility that we're told is cabinet in confidence, but as far as we can tell, it was limited to sewer, water and train lines. So I expect there's a whole package of work that's got to be done around schools, because you won't find too many local government areas in Sydney that can cater with anywhere near this type of growth with the existing school capacity they've got. Most of it's a generalisation, but most of our public schools, particularly down south, will be at capacity. By the time you get up towards North Turramurra, you'll have capacity in Ku-ring-gai High School, for example, but generally most schools in Ku-ring-gai, the public schools, are already operating above capacity. So that is certainly an issue that has been skirted over at a state level to this point. Yep. I mean, if you boil down the transit-oriented development SEP to its base policy objective, it's about putting people close to a train station so they don't need to drive a car. Now, I think, even as a planner, I think that's a bit naive. So the exclusions from the policy didn't cover extra capacity on local roads, roundabouts, traffic lights, things like that that would ordinarily be dealt with by the local council. And those state-level infrastructure contributions aren't coming to council to do that kind of work. They might go to the state government to do a bit of work on the Pacific Highway, for example. But $200 million across the life of this project doesn't widen the bridge at Pymble, for example. I mean, that alone is a couple of $100 million thereabouts, just putting up a rough number on it. I don't know what the Boundary Road work was years ago, but that was, you know, lots of zeros attached to that. So yeah, there's lots of things the council will have to identify, prioritise and effectively carry out within existing funding streams.
Okay, well that seems to... one more question. One more.
Yeah, thank you. It's just a follow-on about the comment about capped rates. My understanding is that applies for residential properties. What's the situation if you are a recreation facility, scout hall, tennis club, bowling club that's within the TOD zone? How are rates applied, given that the valuations would increase dramatically in that case? So how would businesses be affected in those zones?
Businesses and clubs are all affected the same way, just as residential properties. So it's all about the relativities. So if the land value of a tennis club went up proportionally more than the rest of the municipality, their rates would go up proportionally more. But if everyone in the municipality's land value, even if everyone's land value doubled, everyone's rates would go up exactly the same amount. So it's all just your land value compared to someone else's determine how much of the pie, the rates pie, you pay. So in the sake of a club, if land value, if it was in the TOD and the land value went up dramatically, if it went up more than elsewhere, which it may well if it's in the TOD, because probably the TOD land values might be expected to increase more than someone in just an R2 zone who might end up being able to do a dual occupancy. So probably you could expect land values in the TOD to increase at a greater rate than elsewhere. So you probably could expect the council rates to increase at a greater rate as well. No, so what's capped is the total amount of rates that council can raise across the whole LGA. So we can only ever increase the total rates by what IPART says, which let's say it's 3%. So we could have, if our rates were $70 million, we could add 3% to it. And then the land values determine who pays which amount. It just distributes the rates.
So you also mentioned scout halls. I think from memory, there's only one privately owned scout hall in Ku-ring-gai. It probably is in the Lindfield TOD. All of the rest would be on council or Crown land. So there's only one impact, and that's the one in off Street.
Okay, everyone. Oh, okay. One more question, and that's one more. One more, that's all.
Thank you. If I can just ask you, and this is drilling in on the heritage properties, and perhaps a property that is isolated as a heritage property. and the amalgamation of the allotments around it. At what point may a developer use the initiative of the state strategic development to perhaps avoid the application becoming before council? Thank you.
That's a slightly tricky question because I don't think all of the ends have been tied up at the moment. But if you had a development where the capital investment value was more than $75 million and it included affordable housing, that pathway could theoretically be open to you to have the state assess that type of application.
The values that they are putting out here, is that 75 million, is that including acquisition?
No. No.
Okay, everyone, thanks so much for coming tonight.